My topic for my ethics paper is physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide occurs when a physician facilitates a patient's death by providing the means and or the information to enable the patient to perform the life-ending act. A brief summary of this controversy is between both sides and having to do with the freedom of choice for the patient in considering the healthcare professional's role in their oath as physicians. When looking at the controversy, we can see that there are two sides. In accordance with the patient, physician-assisted suicide can be seen as a painless death and can put the patient at ease. Patients' fight for autonomy and the right to choose what treatment should be available to the patient is very important. Autonomous individuals have moral authority of their time, and if they see that their death is approaching, they should be able to control the time and manner of their death. As for the physician, there is more controversy due to moral and ethical dilemmas. Physicians are against physician-assisted suicide due to non-maleficence. When basing it off the Hippocratic Oath, physicians state, "I will not administer a deadly poison to anyone when asked to do so." Physician-assisted suicide may distract reform from end-of-life care, and it could cause a psychosocial impact on the physician since he is the one prescribing the medication. This topic is important to be talked about because for the patient, it can be a relief of suffering. It can give the patient a sense of autonomy even when they are slowly losing all bodily functions, and it is considered a safer medical practice. When we're looking at who's affected by physician-assisted suicide, we should look at three people. The physicians are affected because they have a moral obligation to protect and respect all human life. The patient, because he is slowly losing autonomy and not being able to do daily tasks or participate in activities that they used to. And patients' families and friends, because they had to prepare to unfortunately lose a loved one. When looking at how physician-assisted suicide can be a burden on the healthcare system, we could see that it could have psychological effects on the physicians as they are the one ending the patient's life. Over time, this can put a weight on the physician's shoulders and can have the physician questioning his role as a healer. Another thing we could look at is how legalizing physician-assisted suicide could take away from funds and reforming palliative care or end-of-life care. Another aspect we have to look at when considering the legalization of physician-assisted suicide is cost. If physician-assisted suicide were to be made legal in all states, where would the funding come from? For example, Washington is one of the states where physician-assisted suicide is legal. Shortly after, Washington subcommittees took the first steps in making it illegal to use federal funds for physician-assisted suicide. Another thing to add is that physician-assisted suicide may save thousands of dollars from not using end-of-life care. For example, for patients with ALS, they may have to live with constant treatment to help control the pain and necessity for help with activities of daily living, depending on how slow their progression is. This can take a toll on the family and cause burnout in the caregiver. If a terminally ill patient were to decide to proceed with physician-assisted suicide, the difference in cost would be significantly different and would help end the suffering of the family and the patient. The thesis statement for my paper is, while as a physician you should do everything in your power to prevent harm to your patient, a terminally ill patient should have the right to choose what treatment should be available to them, including physician-assisted suicide, while considering ethical principles. In the next couple slides, I will go over the ethical principles that come in conflict with this case. Beneficence is acting in ways that promote the welfare of others. In physician-assisted suicide, we can look at this in two different ways. One could be providing comfort to the dying, and another could be intention to cause death. Utility is the focus on the consequences of the actions and not the action itself. In this case, we can look at terminally ill patients using a ventilator that could be used for someone else. As patients are using end-of-life care, there are more appliances used, such as catheters and motorized wheelchairs. Now, looking at the ethical principles that come in conflict, we can see that the three are autonomy, justice, and non-maleficence. The most important principle is autonomy. rational individuals should be permitted to be self-determinating. When applying autonomy to this case, we could say that patients should be able to make the choice on their own healthcare decisions and treatment. Going hand in hand with that principle is justice. Justice is the equal treatment for all individuals. Applying it to this case, we can see that terminally ill patients in their final phase of life should have options available promoting dignity and alleviating the suffering of the patient and allowing them to make their own autonomous choices. Both of these principles can clash with non-maleficence. Non-maleficence is commonly known by above all, do no harm, and in this case, it is against the physician's position to do harm to their patient. It may go against their oath of being a healer. The two most important principles that we should take away from this case are autonomy and non-maleficence. These two principles clash because with autonomy, patients are able to make their own choices regarding the treatment they want to receive. When terminally ill patients are losing all function of their body, they may want to turn to physician-assisted suicide. Unfortunately, according to the AMA Medical Code of Ethics, it is not ethically right to end a patient's life and is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as a healer. When looking at the AMA Code of Medical Ethics, we can see how physician-assisted suicide may cause problems. In Chapter 5, Opinions on Caring for Patients at the End of Life, we can see this direct quote. As patients near the end of life, physicians play important roles in helping them make often difficult decisions and in providing compassionate care that is respectful of patients' values, goals, and preferences. Now we'll take a look at a state that has legalized physician-assisted suicide. Oregon had 27 patients who had used legal physician-assisted suicide in 2000. The total number of prescriptions that have been written were 1,178. When looking at this number, we can see that there are many terminally ill patients who are seeking a different treatment because they have no other option. When physicians were asked why this lethal medication was requested, they said that the patient felt like they were losing autonomy, losing control of bodily functions, had a lot of physical suffering, and they had the decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable. Although it is hard to keep both sides on one agreement, there could be certain requirements that could benefit both parties. Certain requirements could be that the patient must be terminally ill. We can put a time requirement into place. For instance, if the patient is seen to have less than 6 months to live, and a consent requirement. So the consent must be signed from the patient and only the patient, or like in Oregon, multiple consent forms and a time period between signing of the informed consent. In conclusion, it comes down to the fight for the patient's autonomy and the physician's oath in accordance with non-maleficence.